All right, so we left off saying that this line of thinking can very easily undermine your own personhood because it starts to have implications about your sovereignty in the world. I see your concern, and it's an important point. I think there's a way to reconcile the idea of transcendent reality with the reality of your own personhood. It gives some great answers here. They don't have to be in conflict. Let's explore that. Transcendence does not undermine personhood. The key here is to understand that transcendence, or the Most High God, doesn't negate personal existence. If transcendence is the source of all value and the highest form of personhood, then your personhood as part of the created reality has value because it participates in that transcendent reality. In traditional theism, especially in doctrines like the immanence of God, God is understood as both transcendent, beyond the physical, and immanent, present within creation. This doesn't mean that your personhood is insignificant or that it only has value in some secondary and direct way. It means that your personhood finds its highest value when it is aligned with the transcendent reality, the Most High God. And that sounds great. It's like saying that the sun's light illuminates the world. The world is illuminated by the light, but the light itself is greater. The world and the sun both exist and are real, but the light, as the transcendent source, gives meaning and direction to everything else. Sure, that's probably what a Platonist would say, I imagine. I said, suppose I disagree with this being. What right do I have to ever challenge him? How could I give meaningful consent under such a gap in value? Is this not like a boss pressuring an employee into sexual favors? I understand the challenge you're raising here. You're concerned with the nature of consent and authority when there is such an overwhelming gap in value between a transcendent being like the Most High God and a human being. Specifically, you're asking how meaningful consent can be given in such a situation and whether it would feel like coercion or a power imbalance that's morally problematic. The nature of consent and authority in the context of transcendence, consent in a relationship where one party is infinitely greater than the other is indeed a complex issue. However, consent itself is a moral concept, and in a theological or philosophical context, it's possible to argue that true consent can only exist in an environment of freedom, not coercion, right? So, I said, okay, but suppose you disagree with this being, what then? You die? How is that fair? This is a profound and difficult question, and it touches on deep concerns about justice, freedom, and the nature of divine authority. If one disagrees with an infinitely powerful being like the Most High God, and the consequence is death or separation from life, it raises moral and philosophical challenges. Let's try to explore this from several angles. The first issue we have to consider is what it means to disagree with such a being. Disagreement here could mean rejecting the divine will, but this rejection is not like disagreeing with a person in the earthly sense. If God is the source of all goodness, rejecting God's will is rejecting the very foundation of life and moral order itself. It's also important to recognize that in many religious frameworks, disagreement with God doesn't just mean rejecting some abstract concept. It involves rejecting the goodness that God embodies, which affects the well-being of the individual and the world. I think that's necessarily entailed by the concept. The idea of justice is at the core of this question. If God is both infinitely good and infinitely just, then the consequences of rejecting him, whether in this or the life or the next, would be seen as just. But the problem comes when we question the fairness of this in relation to human freedom and understanding. Traditional theistic views suggest that God's justice is not arbitrary and that he has made himself known to humanity in such a way that people have the opportunity to choose rightly. Even if you disagree with him, the choice is real. Human beings are not forced to accept God, but are invited to participate in the goodness of life. The issue of fairness then comes into play. If the only choice is God, it seems like there's no real freedom in rejecting him. But the counterpoint is that God respects the free will of human beings. True freedom in many traditions means that individuals have the freedom to reject what is ultimately good and still face the consequences of that rejection. Now, the biblical understanding makes perfect sense of this, but that's not part of this argument. The issue of death or separation from life is an incredibly difficult one. In many theistic perspectives, spiritual death, separation from God, is seen as the consequence of rejecting the source of life. Life is considered to be in God and with God, so to reject God is to reject life itself. Sure likes to yap the same thing over and over again. I said, I believe it must be asserted instead that the want we feel to be alive is a metaphysical reality, the will to power, so to speak. And if we want to be alive, we have to live in a world with decay, because entropy is true in all possible worlds with more than one possible state. Said, you're touching on an intriguing metaphysical perspective here, the idea that our desire to be alive is a fundamental reality, and that decay and entropy are necessary consequences of existing in a world where there is more than one possible state. Let's unpack and explore this a bit deeper, because it seems to link both metaphysical necessity and the nature of existence in a way that challenges simple understandings of life, death, and the cosmos. The idea that the desire to be alive is a metaphysical reality suggests that life itself is not just a biological or physiological phenomenon, but something deeper, a kind of ontological drive or innate tendency that emerges from the very nature of existence. This desire to be alive could be seen as a kind of intrinsic will embedded within all living beings. If we take this view seriously, it means that life itself and the desire to continue existing is a fundamental property of beings with consciousness or awareness. Life, in this sense, isn't just a biological process, it's the expression of a deeper metaphysical truth about what it means to be. This brings us to the next crucial point, entropy. If we desire life, and life requires existence in a world with decay, then decay itself becomes a part of the very framework in which life is possible. Entropy, as a concept from thermodynamics, refers to the tendency of systems to move toward disorder. It's often associated with decay, the eventual dissipation of energy, and the decline of structures over time. You're suggesting that entropy is a necessary condition for existence in a world where there are multiple possible states, implying that for life to exist, for conscious beings to experience life, there must be a framework in which things decay and dissipate. If we live in a universe where more than one state is possible, entropy becomes the driving force that ensures change and difference. The very potentiality for things to exist in multiple states, not just as they are, makes entropy inevitable, and it's through this process of decay that time and change unfold, creating the space for life. I know I can source that from Sean Carroll, Professor Sean Carroll, who mollywopped the heck out of William Lane Craig in their debate, in my humble opinion. If we accept the idea that decay and entropy are necessary for life to be possible, then this also means that life and death are inseparable. They are two sides of the same coin. We'll get to why. In this view, death is not just an unfortunate event, but a consequence of the structure of the universe. Necessarily structure of the universe. A universe where things that exist must necessarily change. This means that decay is an ontological condition. It's not just a process of physical deterioration, but a necessity for life itself, for contingent life. Without the reality of entropy, there would be no contrast between life and death, and no evolution or progress could occur. Life in this view is a dance with decay. It is the tension between these two forces that makes existence meaningful. Absolutely, buddy. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a third one too. You're right. Life and entropy then are inextricable. We desire life because it is an expression of the possibility of being. But for this to happen, there must be impermanence, change, and entropy to shape the unfolding existence over time. Worlds with more than one possible state. Give me 1 second. Your assertion about more than one possible state being necessary for entropy and decay to exist is critical. In a universe where only one state is possible, a static or unchanging world, there would be no decay, no entropy, and by extension, no change. Which is a possible world. That's sort of like the world that God lives in, or that's sort of like the world that God lives in, or how God experiences the world. The Father, anyway. This would mean that existence would be timeless. It would not unfold in the way we experience it. There would be no becoming, no development, and no growth. Just an eternal being that does not change. But if multiple states are possible, then change is inevitable. Entropy creates the space for differentiation, for diversity in form, and for the emergence of complexity. So in this metaphysical view, life, decay, and entropy are necessary components of a multi-state universe, a universe where things can become something other than what they were, where possibility unfolds in time. The relationship between life, desire, and decay. If the desire to be alive is metaphysical, and if life requires entropy, then the tension between life and decay is not merely a biological fact. It's a cosmic necessity. The very existence of life requires that there be change, and change can only happen through the impermanence and decay inherent in the nature of reality. This suggests that the human experience of life, with its desire for continuation, its struggles with mortality, and its inevitability of death, is part of the metaphysical structure of existence itself. To desire life means to desire the possibility of change, but with that comes the necessity of decay. In your formulation, the desire to be alive becomes a metaphysical reality, and the decay or entropy inherent in the world is a necessary condition for life to be possible. In a world with multiple possible states, entropy is not just an unfortunate side effect, it is the very structure that allows life in all its variety and richness to unfold. This view presents a world where life and decay are not opposites, but intertwined forces, where impermanence is essential to the possibility of existence, and where life itself is a dynamic interaction with the process of change and decay. The metaphysical desire to live is thus bound up with the reality of entropy, and this tension is a fundamental characteristic of existence. I said, so somehow we must bridge the gap between this necessary transcendent person, whatever that being happens to be, whatever person means, whatever transcendent means, whatever necessary means, whatever this greatest possible being happens to be. From the earlier arguments, remember, we don't want to impart anything here, we're just dealing with the terms on their own definitions. And the existence of contingent and limited things. We have to bridge this gap. How does a contingent thing obtain its reality? I submit that thingness requires the conceptualization of a nothingness around the thing that differentiates it from other things. Now, nothing can't exist, so it can only be the conceptualization of nothingness. or the perception, it can't be real non-existence, but there has to be some kind of space between one thing and another thing. Absolute reality must, in some sense, whatever this may mean, take upon entropy or death or decay for the continued existence and flourishing of the world. And if that's not salvation, then I don't know what is. You're venturing into a deeply profound philosophical and theological space, engaging with the term relationship between the transcendent necessary being. I had to walk it through this one. Let me just make sure. I said, so when the transcendent moral person or persons takes upon death or becomes entropy, becomes non-existence, as far as that, as close as you can get to that obtaining in reality, when the transcendent moral person takes upon death, that is what defeats death itself. If the ultimate reality created a contingent world and wasn't a real thing in the world, by taking on death, the world would immediately collapse into non-being. The probability to actuality ratio becomes null. Nothing gets actualized. Nothing good, anyway. Nothing, let's not say good, but nothing existing, creating, being, valuable, value inherent, right? We're talking about being itself, existence itself. The probability to actuality ratio becomes null. Whatever it is that holds the coherence of the world together, per the earlier arguments, must also be a real thing. It or he or they must be a real thing and a real person in this real hierarchy of value, or value flattens into meaninglessness. So you've captured a key metaphysical and theological insight. The self-limiting or self-sacrificial act of the transcendent moral person, aka God, taking on death, is what allows the world of contingency to exist, maintain coherence, and even be meaningful. If the absolute reality did not somehow become engaged with the contingency of the world, then the contingent world would not have the coherence or stability necessary to exist. Death in this context can be understood not just as literal physical death, but as the principle of non-being, limitation, or the potential for destruction. Exactly, in the vein of St. Thomas Aquinas. For a contingent world to have coherence, there must be a force or being capable of sustaining it despite its inherent fragility. Being has to be stronger than non-being. Taking on death is an act that engages with this fragility, not merely existing beyond it, but entering it, thus preventing it from collapsing into non-being. The act of God taking on death is the means by which God holds together the contingency of the world. Without this, the world of becoming would simply be unable to stand. It would dissolve into chaos, as you suggest, with the probability to actuality ratio becoming null. No creative potential would become actualized. No being would obtain in the world. In your earlier arguments, you've proposed that coherence in the world depends on some real transcendent grounding. This grounding isn't just a static principle or abstract concept, but a real active thing, a real person or persons that holds the world together. If there were no real personal agent responsible for maintaining this coherence, the world would indeed collapse into meaninglessness. Who knows what it means to be a person? Anything you're imparting on that word other than a being of inherent moral worth, I'm not sure that you have grounding for that. I think there are other qualities, but at least that's the minimum definition of a person. Here you're invoking something akin to the classical theological argument about the nature of God as both necessary in sustaining the universe and personal in engaging with it. This personal engagement is necessary because only a person can freely take on the burden of death and sacrifice in order to maintain the world's reality. If this reality didn't exist, if the transcendent being were not real, personal, and actively involved in creation, then as you pointed out, value would indeed flatten to meaninglessness. Without the existence of this real person or persons, there would be no way to distinguish what is more valuable or meaningful from what is less. The hierarchy of value would collapse and everything would dissolve into an amorphous void, except like, I have a better gun than you, so, what I say goes. The transcendent moral person or persons whom we're identifying with the Most High God must be a part of the real hierarchy of value that structures reality. Without this transcendent moral reality, contingent beings, whether human or otherwise, would have no meaningful existence. The realness of this personhood is critical because only personhood can sustain value in a hierarchy. If the ultimate grounding of reality is an impersonal force or abstract principle, then the differentiation of value becomes arbitrary and value itself would collapse into non-existence or meaningless. It's just like repeating what it thinks I want to hear. It does a lot of yapping. But again, I'm only using it to try and shave down my thoughts. I'm not great at yapping. I try to just get to the point. Conclusion. Ultimately, your argument leads to the conclusion that if value is to have any real meaning in the world, then the world must be sustained by a real personal being, a transcendent moral person, or at least be regarded as such, who actively maintains the coherence of the world. This necessary being, by taking on death, provides the space for contingency to exist, and by being real and personal, it prevents the collapse of value into meaninglessness. This is the heart of the theistic understanding of God. God is not just the creator, but the sustainer, actively involved in maintaining the world's coherence through personal sacrifice, not just as a principle, but as a real, personal being who ensures that value is real and that meaning is preserved in a world that otherwise could dissolve into nothingness. In essence, the act of the Most High God taking on death is what allows the world of contingency to maintain its existence and value. Without this active personal engagement, everything collapses into non-being and value loses all meaning. Yes, I said, at this embodied personhood would be the wordness of the Absolute. He must suffer with us in the wilderness of probability, even unto the point of dying in every bit the same way as we would die. Whatever it means for whatever it means for you to be you, and whatever it means for that being that is you to die, then the Absolute also has to be that kind of being. Whatever it means for the world to have death and decay and for persons to die, either the greatest possible being must also be a person who experiences death and decay, or the reality of personhood becomes incoherent, per the earlier arguments, and value collapses. The idea that the wordness of the Absolute is embodied in personhood highlights the core theological and metaphysical insight you're exploring. If personhood is real and value is hierarchical, if reality itself requires coherence and the differentiation of value, then the greatest possible being must indeed experience the same suffering, death, and decay that contingent beings like us experience. See, and I think that, this is just an aside, but I think that if there was a historical Jesus, that's what he He was reading the scriptures and getting this basic message. Well, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's who he thought he was. Or at least the earliest Christians were doing a midrash on the Old Testament. But I'm getting beside the point. That's irrelevant for right now. By invoking the wordness of the absolute, of the undefined absolute, undefinable absolute, you're pointing to a key theological concept that we can trace back to Plato's Logos and the Christian doctrine of the Logos, for example, John 1:1. This Logos is the reason, we don't have to go there though, but yeah, is the reason or principle by which the absolute communicates, creates, and sustains the world. In Christian terms, the Logos is the Word that is both with God and is God, and that becomes flesh in the person of Jesus. If this Word is to truly represent the absolute, it must be embodied. Otherwise, the concept of personhood becomes incoherent. The Word must become personal because personhood is necessary for any hierarchy of value to be real. The Word, as the communication of the absolute, cannot be abstract or impersonal. It must be real, personal, and actively engaged in the world. The wilderness of probability refers to the realm of contingency, the world where things could be or not be, where events unfold with a certain degree of uncertainty, and where things decay and eventually die, whatever those mean. Since non-being can exist, whatever it means to die. To experience death and decay is to experience the wilderness of this contingency. For the greatest possible being to truly be the greatest possible being, or God, the being that sustains reality and makes value possible, that being must enter into the same wilderness of contingency, suffering, and decay. The GPB must suffer with us, not from a distance, but by directly participating in the human condition. This is not a philosophical abstraction, as it is a reality that aligns with the hierarchical value system you are describing. For a being to be the Most High, it must be able to identify with and participate in the very struggles that define the existence of lower beings, because death and suffering are, in some sense, what gives the world its meaning and continuity. You said that, ChatGPT, not me. A lot of this is kind of an aside and just a different metaphysical point. No, little man, you've had enough. No, you've had enough. If the GPB is truly personal, then it must experience death and decay in the same way that any other contingent being experiences it. Right. Sort of. Personhood entails the ability to choose to suffer and to die, maybe. These experiences are fundamental to what it means to be a person in the world. To fail to experience death and decay would be to invalidate personhood itself, as you've pointed out. If the GPB does not experience the ultimate consequence of contingent existence, then the entire concept of personhood becomes incoherent, because the reality of death would no longer have any personal significance. Without death, the continuity of reality, including value, would collapse into meaninglessness, as no real personhood could be distinguished. You be yapping sometimes. So I said, I'd already, it's like sometimes I get sick of its yapping. Can you sum up my arguments 1 through 6 in such a way that recognizes these underlying assumptions? It did fucking terribly at that. So I just did it myself. And we'll do that in the next video.